The Handkerchief by Great 78. Chapter 70. Lust, Love, and Those Lost. Hermione and Draco thoroughly enjoyed their alone time in the empty classroom together. After one last long kiss, they snuck out into the corridor quietly. "You're both not setting a good example as prefects, you know," a lilting voice said from nearby. They turned quickly and fearfully to see Hannah and Neville further down the corridor, the wizard leaning his back against the wall, arms around his witch's waist, who stood between his legs, her arms around his shoulders. Hannah was smirking at them both. "That'll be detention, that will," Neville piped up. "Come off it, Longbottom. You're not even a prefect," Draco admonished. "Impersonating an authority figure, now that's detention." The four of them giggled a moment, then Hannah and Neville broke apart reluctantly. "Walk you home," Neville said to Hermione, offering his arm. Draco kissed her good night, and she took Neville's arm, wishing Hannah a good night as well. "May I walk you to your common room, Miss Abbott?" He gallantly offered his arm, and she rested her hand atop it in perfect form, recalling their years of dance and movement lessons together every Thursday morning at 10, from the ages of 7 to nearly 11. Schön, perfect, Herr Malfoy, das ist korrekt." They laughed quietly for a moment, and Hannah's excellent imitation of their movement instructor, Frau Gengerschmidt's strict German praise. They'd spent many hours learning how to walk, stand, and sit properly. "Remember, we do not glumph like the hippopotamus," she began, and Draco finished the quote with her. "We glide like the swan." Draco, who had several swans taking up residence in the Malfoy Manor lake, often found this funny. Swans might be graceful, but they were mean little buggers when you got too close. "She was so strict," Hannah exclaimed as they laughed together again. As their grins died away, Draco sobered. "Never thought I'd miss those days. It was all a lot easier, then, wasn't it?" He met her eyes as they rounded a landing between two staircases. "Yes, it was," Hannah said sadly. "Hannah, I've been meaning to tell you. I was so sorry to hear about your mother. I remember her. She was a sweet woman. She didn't deserve—" To his horror, he heard his voice crack with emotion, and he stopped talking, clearing his throat loudly. "I appreciate that, Draco. I know you're in a tough position, pulled in 2 different directions and all that," Hannah said, taking his hand briefly and squeezing it, as they rounded the next landing and started down the main staircase for the entrance hall. "I don't want to be, but it's tough. I have to think about my mother, too. If I don't, well, suffice to say, she's not truly safe, and I worry that I'll let her down, and not be around to protect her, you know." They had reached the corridor off the entrance hall that led to the Hufflepuff common room. He stepped back to allow her to go in front of him, but she stopped him by placing a hand on his arm. "Draco, whatever you can do to protect your mom, you should do it. Hermione, too." He sighed and reached across himself to put his hand over hers, patting it gently. "I'm trying," he whispered, not trusting his voice. She smiled up at him gently, squeezing his arm once more, and turned to go down the corridor, past the kitchens to the Hufflepuff's common room. He watched her go thoughtfully, then doubled back to head for his own common room. He was trying, but his heart wasn't truly in it. Yes, he fiercely wished to protect Hermione, his mother, and his friends, but the idea of having to do what he'd been ordered to do made him physically ill. But time was not stopping for him. Only a month remained in the school year, and still the cabinet wasn't ready, and he felt even less ready than the cabinet. As his birthday fell on a Thursday, it was a normal school day for him. He woke to find a small collection of gifts on his bed. There was the traditional gift of an heirloom watch from his parents, and a box of sweets from Pym. There were tickets to the Universiade this summer, being held in Sicily, from Blaise and Theo. From Hermione there was a small burnished silver clip, engraved with DLM on one side. On the other side was engraved a short quote: "He who has love will always be rich." He smiled to himself. It was a nice sentiment, and the clip was clearly of good quality, but he didn't know what it was for. He withdrew his handkerchief from under the pillow and spoke the password. "Thank you so much for the gift. It is very beautiful, and I love the quote. But can you tell me what the clip is used for?" "Oh my goodness, Draco! I didn't even think that you might not know what it is. It's a money clip, for your muggle money. You fold the notes in half and slip them inside. I didn't think. Wizarding money is all coins. I should have made you a money bag, not a clip." "No, I love it. Besides, once all this is past, I plan to spend plenty of time in the muggle world. Those dodgems don't drive themselves, you know." "Happy birthday, my love." More and more, as the next week passed, Draco was preoccupied with thoughts about the Avada curse. It was so final, so permanent. The idea of ending a life, it was too much to comprehend. He didn't even think he could have brought off the Cruciatus curse that he tried to lob at Potter, when Potter knocked him flat with that slashing curse. It was clear that he needed the help that the cabinet could provide, even if he didn't want any of Voldemort's people near Hermione, or anyone else he cared about for that matter. There was no way that he could carry this out alone. Snape continued to try and butt in with offers of help, but more and more during Defense Against the Dark Arts classes, Draco was certain that Snape was still working with Dumbledore. The man was very focused on everyone learning proper defensive techniques. This wasn't a wizard who wanted a bunch of defenseless people running around to pick off one by one. Draco was almost certain that telling Snape would likely result in him telling Dumbledore. If that happened, he'd be in Azkaban within minutes, he was sure. By the middle of June, he was no longer sleeping. His nightmares had gotten so bad that he often stayed the night in the room of requirement, where no one but the birds could hear his fitful starts and screams. He emerged for classes, usually checking in with Hermione to be certain that Potter wasn't watching for him, and occasionally meals. It wasn't comfortable by any stretch, but he had to finish this cabinet. He worked on it every spare moment he got, trying different incantations, different wand movements. He was going spare, trying to make it work. The room of requirement had a mouse. Well, at one time it had been a mouse. After an unfortunate transfiguration attempt by an inept student, it now hopped like a rabbit and had tiny, delicate, sharp antlers. In the months leading up to now, the creature had scurried and scuttled around the room when he entered, hiding in fear somewhere. But as time passed, with Draco around nearly constantly, the creature became less timid by degrees. By now it was willing to come out of hiding almost as soon as Draco entered, and would scurry up to him to accept whatever scraps of food that Draco had saved for him. He even let Draco pet him a bit. Draco had tried numerous spells on the cabinet to reverse the vanishing effect, to no avail. A few still seemed to do nothing, whilst others caused it to shudder so much that Draco worried he would need to repair it again. He had high hopes for Ruminatio Maxima, as this spell meant return, but could also mean duplication. Far from fixing it, however, it seemed to make the time-space between the two cabinets stretch even longer. The next apple to go through came back as a black melting lump of oozing juice. Regressus Maxima seemed the closest to actually working so far. The apple came back nearly perfect, barely any soft spots even. The same held true for the small bouquet of flowers that he conjured, as well as the small bowl of ice cream that he'd nicked from the Great Hall. He'd held it under a stasis charm until it was time to send, and it came back barely melted. The next day he was determined. He would try something alive. It was the next necessary step. Since the day that the birds had gotten stuck inside the cabinet, Draco had dreaded this moment. He knew he would need to smuggle in a frog or a mouse from Transfigurations, and the idea of what it would look like when it returned, if it returned, turned his stomach. That wasn't even taking into account that he'd likely be condemning an animal, possibly multiple animals, to death. But it was necessary. If actual living people were meant to come through, as much as he detested the idea, knowing who associated with Voldemort, he'd have to try it on an animal, a vertebrate with a brain. Now here he was, and he had an animal at the ready, he thought, looking down at the unusual creature who stared back up at him curiously. He wouldn't need to break into McGonagall's menagerie after all. At least, not tonight. He withdrew his coin that he'd used to communicate with Borgin, giving him instructions to follow on his end. Then he scooped up the trusting animal, and before he could lose his nerve, deposited it inside and closed the door, breathing a bit harder than absolutely necessary. There was faint scratching from the cabinet's interior. Harmonia nectaire passus. He moved his wand carefully through the movements, focusing on the words to avoid thinking of anything else. 5 minutes passed. 10. Finally, after 12 minutes, his coin warmed in his hand. What did this thing look like before you sent it? Draco spoke aloud, a brief description of the beast that he had most decidedly not named Lopi. Naming it would be a mistake, he knew, so he used his occlumency techniques to attempt to extract the name from his mind. Yes, it is here, just as you described, though it seems lethargic. Send it back, he wrote, although he didn't want to say it. The creature had a chance, still. It was alive. It had arrived in one piece. It has been sent, came Borgin's message a moment later. He waited, timing it on his watch. At 7 minutes and 35 seconds, he heard a faint noise inside the cabinet. He opened it slowly, apprehensive of what he was about to find. Lopi's antlers had been broken off during its journey. The little animal was still quite lethargic, but now there was blood. It oozed from a small gash in the beast's chest. It also bled from its left foot, which the poor creature had apparently gnawed off at some point in the journey. Draco fought down bile as he considered what to do. Lopi, his mind retorted firmly, was not going to live for long. Even if Draco knew creature healing spells, he didn't think the tiny mind would ever be the same, the way its eyes rolled about, unable to focus. He thought only a second. Backing out of the cabinet, he found a pillow that had a large rip in the front, stuffing spilling out of it. He opened the cabinet door once more, the little yellow birds flitting wildly around his shoulders, whipping his hair in their frenzy. He put the pillow over Lopi's body and pressed down hard. There was a thrashing under his hands, but thankfully no cries. He waited, pressing harder, teeth clenched painfully, vision blurred with unshed tears, willing his arms to stay strong. After a minute, the thrashing stopped. He waited another minute to be sure. When he withdrew the pillow, he saw the still, unbreathing form of the odd little creature. The birds flapped and twittered and cried above him as he summoned a small chest that he'd spotted from across the room. Lettering across the top read Aragog in messy writing. Inside was a soft green blanket, like one might have for a small baby, and a gold bowl that looked as though it had been nicked from a meal in the great hall. He removed the bowl. With his hand, he levitated the small creature inside the box, then arranged the green blanket around it gently. He closed the box, and with his wand drew a line through the name Aragog. Above it, in his best penmanship, he wrote, Lopi. Then he vanished the box with a whispered, Evanesco. There was a small pop and a clang far in the depths of the room as the small box reappeared, this coffin no more properly vanished than the cabinet that the poor creature had died in. The birds continued their sad cacophony over his head for the lost beast. He was done for the night, he thought. His mother had been right. The sound of a pining bird can be so haunting. Chapter 71. The 3 Ds. Drinks, dresses, distractions. There was a bit less than a week left in the school year. Draco was nodding off in classes, as he spent most of his evenings working on the cabinet. He was lucky. Hermione, Theo, and Blaise kept him supplied with notes, even revising a few essays for him. But he knew exams were approaching and no one could take them for him. Every class was in revision mode. Most major projects had been turned in. His and Hermione's Ancient Runes translation project had gotten top marks, as he knew it would. As Potter was now back to his usual lack of potions prowess, Draco was back in the top 2 in potions class with Hermione. His revision session with Neville and the others had him feeling confident about herbology, and arithmancy and charms came easy to him. Hagrid's exam was likely to be a cakewalk, and Professor Trelawney's was always a complete unknown to Draco, not having been blessed with the gift of seeing the future. Professor McGonagall's exam was and would always be a bugger, and there was no getting around it. Professor Snape's would likely be the same, as he seemed determined to teach them 6 years' worth of defense against the dark arts in 1 year. So it was these 2 classes that Draco focused on staying awake the most. Not to mention, both professors would drag him up by the ear if he did not. Transfiguration's revision was decidedly difficult, as Professor McGonagall expected them to be able to break down Gamp's laws to their purest forms and explain them in detail. They would also be focusing on human transfigurations, as well as larger vertebrates. Professor Snape's revision was equally detailed, as they discussed various hazards and dangerous creatures, the importance of nonverbal spells, and how to incorporate charms, hexes, jinxes, and transfigurations into defensive spells. It was on Friday, half an hour into Snape's revision lesson, that his brain snagged on something that was said. There was something about reviving inferi that stuck in his mind. "And what was the spell you said would make an Inferius?" Seamus Finnegan asked, writing his notes furiously. "I didn't say what the spell was, Mr. Finnegan. Please pay better attention," Snape droned. "But can you tell us the incantation, sir?" Seamus asked. "Are you looking to create an army, Mr. Finnegan?" There were several titters throughout the room, especially from the old members of Dumbledore's army. "No, sir. Just wanting to know when to start running, sir." The class cracked up in laughter. "The incantation is Revivisco Totalus. Now, as I'm sure you know, this incantation will not work without proper wand movement and serious intent. Moving on, if you turn to page 416... Sir." Draco took a chance and raised his hand. "Can you tell me what is the translation of Revivisco? My Latin may not be exact, but I believe it is to regenerate, to resurrect, to restore to life." "Thank you, sir." Draco wrote all of this down in a stupor. Something about this sounded right. He didn't need to find an unvanishment charm, because there really wasn't such a thing. And he wasn't trying to conjure a new vanishing cabinet. He was trying to resurrect and restore to life the old one. As he walked out of class in a daze, he only barely registered the look of concern that crossed Hermione's face. "Drake, mate, we've got the whole weekend planned," Theo enthused as he arrived back in the Slytherin common room from his final class that afternoon. Music was already pumping from the large wireless over the fireplace, and students were pulling out stores of fire whiskey, cinnamon-spiced vodka, smoking gin and butterbeer from their rooms, and lining bottles up on the huge table near the windows. "It's going to be an all-night party tonight. Then we're going down for breakfast in the morning and sleep until dinner. Then, after a quick swim in the Black Lake, we're going to party outside until Violetta lets us back in the castle on her last round at 2 a.m. We sleep until breakfast, and then on Sunday it's nothing but revision." Theo presented this idea as though it were both gospel and the best idea that anyone had ever come up with in the history of ideas. "Merlin, Theo, that sounds fucking awful," Draco groused. "Are you sure? Because I take Muggle studies with Parvati and Katie, and they have it on good authority that they can get Granger here tonight. They're even going to choose an outfit for her," Theo finished, waggling his brows suggestively. "You know she can dress herself, right?" "I know. I've seen Parvati in a sheer crop top and a leather miniskirt that will melt your fucking eyeballs, mate. So when that minx offers to dress your girlfriend, you bloody well say thank you and shut up," responded Theo. "I thought you were still hung up on Eliza," Draco mused. "Oh, I am. But she and I have an understanding. The school year is open season. We see who we like. Nothing wrong with playing the field. I know Eliza isn't staying home every weekend." Well, thought Draco, one small party can't hurt. He would have one drink, dance with his witch in a darker corner of the room, maybe sneak away for a quick snog with her, and he'd be in the room of requirement, trying the spell and wand movements by midnight. No problem. This was a problem. Even though he'd asked the fourth year who was manning the bar to make his drinks weak, the boy poured with a heavy hand, meaning Draco was solidly and irredeemably sauced by the time Hermione walked in nervously with her two fellow lionesses. She came in wearing a short Gryffindor red dress that looked as though she'd been poured into it. The dress began just below the curve of her tits and ended about an inch below her bum. It moulded to her every curve, leaving little to the imagination. It was clear that regular knickers could not be worn under this dress, and the thought got him excited within seconds of realizing it. And to finish off the look, she wore red high-heeled sandals that showed off her toenails, painted silver. Every eye was focused on his witch, and his blue Oxford shirt and black trousers suddenly felt too hot and tight for him. To occupy his hands whilst waiting for the fervour of her arrival to die down, Draco got another drink. After one sip of the smoking gin and juice, he was certain that the fourth-year asshat was pouring triples. He was also certain that he was finishing this drink because it was fucking delicious. Later, in his dormitory, door socked, locked, and warded, the taste of coconut rum on Hermione's tongue mixed with the gin and pineapple on his own. The alcohol didn't dampen his eagerness, but it bolstered Hermione's as she loudly exclaimed her enthusiasm. It wasn't until 5 minutes later that Draco realized he'd forgotten the Muffliato spell. When they were done and had cast the necessary charms, Draco used his wand to vanish the sock hanging from the dormitory door, then lifted the wards and locks, warding his bed instead. She was already half asleep, and he curled up with her draped across his body, thankful for one more night with his perfect witch. "Good morning," she said softly. "That's too loud, Granger," he said, throwing his arm over his eyes. "What time?" "It's almost 3 in the afternoon. We missed lunch, and breakfast too, obviously." "Do you think Dobby—" "Maybe," she said uncertainly. "Dobby?" With a pop, the elf appeared, wearing his Weasley jumper and every sock and hat he'd ever found. "Yes, miss?" Dobby asked eagerly. "If it's not too much trouble, can we get 2 sausage sandwiches with chips, 2 chocolate milkshakes—" "Make mine strawberry," Draco said from under his arm. "1 chocolate and 1 strawberry milkshake, a buttery waffle with syrup, some prawn-flavoured crisps, and the biggest licorice ones you can find." "Yes, miss." The elf popped away happily. "Who's eating all that, Granger?" he asked in wonder, his stomach churning, or maybe growling, at the thought. "Hush," she said. Then, "I wonder why Dobby was wearing all those hats." They stayed in bed until dinner, at which point Hermione said she needed to go to the library to look up old Daily Prophet articles about a witch named Prince, who lived years before. It was something to do with Potter, but Draco was too distracted by what she was wearing to listen properly. She felt that the red party dress from the day before was far too short to wear in the library, so instead she had tucked in the shoulder straps and pulled the entire dress down to fashion a skirt. Then she had borrowed one of Draco's old outgrown white Oxford shirts to wear as a blouse, buttoning a few buttons and then tying the tails together in front, and rolling up the sleeves. She looked delectable. Draco checked that the coast was clear. Most of the Slytherins were either having a kip in preparation for tonight's festivities, or crawling out from whatever rock they'd nearly died under the night before to find sustenance, and had no extra thoughts to spare about looking to see who was sneaking out of the sixth-year dorm. Blaise sat in front of the common room fire, and once Hermione had disappeared up the stairs, Draco joined him. "So, sounds like your night was good." Blaise side-eyed him. "Bugger off," he said grumpily, "like you've never forgotten something like that." "Luckily for me, my witch can cast a damn strong muffliato. It's like Theo said once, Granger really needs to learn silencing charms. She knows them, we just forgot." Then Draco grew worried. Pansy and the other girls didn't hear us, did they? Slytherin wizard code meant that no boy would have shared anything they had seen or heard with anyone else. He could have brought Professor Sprout and Madam Hooch down here for a bit of fun, and no wizard would have said a word. Most of the Slytherin girls either wouldn't care or wouldn't go blabbing about it. Even Astoria, who had finally given up her Draco obsession by the end of 5th year, and had moved on to Cormac McLaggen. That was a match made in heaven, if Draco had ever heard of one. They were two people in love, to be sure, only a slight issue, they were each in love with themselves. But Pansy was a different story. If she saw an immediate advantage to be gained, she'd find the right person to tell about his apparent dalliance with Hermione right then. But if there were a long-term advantage, Pansy always chose that. She could hold the knowledge over his head in order to blackmail him, or she would wait until the right people were in the room to announce it loudly to everyone, thus bringing all eyes to her. Or she could trade her bit of information for an extra luxury. Years before, Draco had thought of Pansy as being like his mother, interested in fashion, flirtatious when needed, quite cunning at times. But now he saw that she was a lot more like Lucius. Both of them did what they wanted with little regard for others. Both watched out for themselves first. And both realized that there was power in knowledge. If there was something to be gained by telling anyone about him and Hermione, Pansy would certainly try. "No, mate, you're lucky. Pansy left with a Gryffindor. I believe it was that 5th-year prefect Colin." Blaise gave him an amused, sideways glance. They both huffed out a laugh. Colin Creevey had shot up in height between his 4th and 5th years, and was hardly recognizable as the young boy that had followed Potter around with a muggle camera in their 2nd year. "Well, I need to get to the library. Study time and all," Draco started, but forgot for a moment to whom he was speaking. "No, you don't, mate. It's our last weekend here. You will have time to do whatever you have to do later. You've said it yourself. Next year won't be the same. Just take a bit of time, yeah?" Blaise was saying hit him like a bludgeon to the chest. This could be his last week at Hogwarts. It could be his last week as a free wizard. It was likely the last week that Hermione would look at him with love in her eyes. It was hard to believe that his school years, his childhood, were nearing an end. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Handkerchief by Great 78.